Erik Darling here with Darling Data, and today Bats and I are going to be talking about something that I think is very, very important to the effective building and maintaining of stored procedures in SQL Server, and that is, of course, debugging. Um, the longer and more complicated your stored procedures get, and especially if they involve dynamic SQL of any real consequence, the more important it becomes to add in steps so that people can find issues, errors, and insights along the way. But equally as important is understanding the context that people doing the debugging will be executing the stored procedures in, so that you target the output to the correct venue. If the debugging is going to be taking place in Management Studio and someone's just going to hit F5 and run it and go off on their merry way, cool. You can just print and select and raise error all you want. It'll do just fine. But if you are going to be running this sort of in a headless way via like an agent job or some other scheduled process, or like from some or even just like an end user doing stuff, you would have to direct that output somewhere else. You would have to put that in a table or something. And it's up to you to figure that out and what needs to be included in that output in order for it to be useful to anyone who might come along and debug it later. Typically, I find that debugging you should start more verbose than you think you need and pare down what you don't need, rather than having to keep adding things in and in and in later. But before we do that, let's talk about some very important things here. Let's talk about how you, wary traveler, can support my efforts to keep producing this content. I offer memberships to the channel. You don't have to sign up for one, but I appreciate it if you do. If you do not feel like signing up for a membership, by clicking on the link in the video description, right around in here somewhere, you can do other things that help me sort of get some joy out of life, liking, commenting, subscribing. And of course, if you would like to ask questions privately that I will answer publicly on my office hours episodes, you can go to that link. Well, you can go to the clickable version of that link down below and ask all your questions. If you need more help with SQL Server than asking a question can possibly provide, well, there are a lot of folks like that out there in the world, and I work with them quite frequently. Make their SQL servers go much, much faster than they are today. If you need a health check, performance analysis, hands-on query, or index tuning, or both probably, if you're having a performance crisis or you want to get your developers trained up to avoid needing all the other stuff, well, I am a consultant, and as always, my rates are reasonable. If you would like to get some training on SQL Server performance tuning, you can do that from me. For about 150 USD, you can get for the rest of your life all 25 hours of my performance tuning content. Again, there's links down below where you can have a wonderful time clicking on things. If you would like to see me live and in person, I will be attending as an organizer SQL Saturday New York City 2025. It's taking place on May 10th with a performance tuning pre-con by Andreas Walter on May the 9th. And they'll both be great times. So if you're looking for something to do in May, in the merry month of May, you've gotten sick of strolling through parks, maybe you could show up to the Microsoft offices in Times Square and do a whole lot of learning about a whole lot of data stuff. But let's move on. Let's talk about debugging. Now, this is a script that I have put up on my GitHub page. There will be a link to it down in the video description, as there are links to everything in the video description. But some important stuff to consider when it comes to debugging. There are essentially three things that you might care about debugging in the context of a stored procedure, depending on what it does. Logic, performance, and dynamic SQL. So, logic would be like control flow stuff. printing dynamic SQL. Performance would be like getting query plans from like the queries that matter in the store procedure. You typically don't want to turn on query plans for everything and have just like SSMS crash because you tried to put 5 billion query plans in the messages and the return results. And then sometimes you may want to generate but not execute dynamic SQL so that you can see what it looks like to fix syntax errors. It's usually a lot easier to like see it printed out, copy and paste it to like a regular window, and then figure out where something went wrong, where that incorrect syntax near like a single apostrophe is, or something like that. A lot of the times that's going to be the silent truncations of your strings, so be very careful with that. Not really related to debugging, just sort of good store procedure hygiene, no count and exact abort. Depending on what the store procedure is doing, you may not want exact abort on because that will force the whole thing to stop running and just basically like return, like the whole thing will terminate rather than just a single statement terminating. So depending on what you're doing, that might be good or bad. No count you usually do want on though, because like that blah blah rows return or rows affected message is annoying. So like stuff that I usually put in there are things for debugging dynamic SQL, things for debugging loops, and other ways to sort of collect sort of like runtime, like information about like contextual environmental information. Like a lot of the scripts that I write, they are for SQL Server analysis, right? So sometimes I have to do things like collect version and edition information, so I know which columns and which DMVs are going to be there, so what I'm allowed to touch, and like different things that I might have access to depending on that. So there are some important debugging things that you might want to get, so that when you go and look at your final results, you understand why there was a problem with something. But that gets that. And then down here, stuff like debug logic, right? So when you want to debug logic, one thing that you're probably going to want to do is have some message print that says the thing you're going into before you go do that thing. Because like if this were dynamic SQL, you could print out the dynamic SQL, right? That would be fine. You could see what it got to. But if you're just running a store procedure and you want to figure out which step you're in and like what query you're about to run, and then when you're finished with that query or something, then just a simple message like this, just informational only. And again, like if you're running this in SSMS and you're fine with just like reading through the results, because that's what most of my work is. Like I'm not like orchestrating things from other places. Like this might be totally fine. If not, you would want to log this to a table somewhere. If you were doing this all in a big transaction, logging it to a table would be impossible, because if you rolled something back, you would if your whole entire procedure is in a transaction and you have set exact abort on, then you would need to log it to a table variable and then put that table variable into a for real logging table after you've done your rollback, like from catching an error. But if you're not using transaction, like one big transaction for the whole thing, if you're using separate transactions for stuff or no transactions for stuff, you don't have as much to worry about with that. You can put stuff in a regular logging table and like see the steps from along the way. When you are dealing with things like loops, or you want to figure out if results get weird because of either like too many or too few rows happening with something, you would want to you could like log the number of rows that came out of that happened in this here, which is sort of like a silent like set no count off, right? Because it doesn't get immediately returned to you, it gets assigned to this variable. And then if you're doing the debug logic stuff in here, then you could print that out as a message and say, hey, this is how many rows you got from sys.databases from that query, right? So you would say in the output, it would be like selecting from sys.databases. This is how many rows are in there. Cool. And then if you were going to select from that table, this is what I like to do so that I know like if a result was empty from something, because I don't always do the row count thing. Sometimes I'm like especially for the analysis procedures, it's like there's not a lot of point. So like what I usually do is towards the end of the procedure, I'll put in something like this with just like all the temp tables that I use so that I can see which ones were empty, right? So like if there's something in the temp table, then we're going to select the table name with like the right table name here. We're going to select all the results from that. But if there's nothing in that table, like it would just say like, it would just be like an empty result set with like, you know, whatever is in the D #D temp table. Sometimes you might want to say something like, hey, that table is empty, right? So you know exactly where along the line things either went wrong or you might have to change stuff. Dynamic SQL, like I said before, is sort of fickle, right? So like just like using like regular like operand stuff, like just saying like string plus this, it'll truncate for just bizarre reasons, right? Like even if you have all your like Unicode end prefixes in there, you just like concatenate this one slightly smaller string onto like a much larger string that's already in varchar max, and should just get it blopped right on and like just maintain the maxness of it. It doesn't always work. So like sometimes it's a very good idea to print out your dynamic SQL. And one sort of like, I mean, just quick and dirty way of, you know, if like print has a limit to how many characters it can spit out and show you. So if the length of your dynamic SQL block is, you know, like maybe like 8,000, like 4,000, 8,000 bytes or something, you might need to have a loop that iterates over your string, your dynamic SQL string, and prints it out in manageable chunks so that you can see the whole thing. And then other stuff that is neat to do if you are using loops, I always find it very, very useful, aside from having debug logic to like tell me when I'm going into the loop, when I've done certain things within a loop, when I finish the loop, to let me know like where I am progress wise, right? And raise error is way better than print for this, because raise error, you can put this no wait command on there, and like print, you're stuck waiting for like buffers to fill up before print will like is forced to print a message. With raise error with no wait, you can skip a lot of that. So, you know, like you could put this all into one raise error. I like to have it in 3, so it's kind of like easy to read through. But, you know, you are starting the loop with a low ID of this number, the high ID of this number, and like the total entries are there. So like, you know, then I have my cursor and, you know, say entering my cursor loop, and you know, some information about like where I am in the cursor. I always find like the fetching next and the incrementing things to be very, very useful, because it helps me catch logical bugs where I maybe didn't do things in the right place. And then of course, when you're finished, it's great to print finished messages here so that you know you're done with the loop and you can move on from there. As far as like performance debugging goes, what I'll usually do is something like this, right? Where like I'll like select a little bit of information about what's happening, and then I will use set statistics XML on, right? So if we're debugging performance, I want to get some information here. I want to turn on query plans for a specific query. I don't want to have query plans for absolutely everything in the procedure. When I get query plans for that stuff, then I'm going to get some finishing information rather. We're going to look at like say that this query finished, this was the end time, and this was the difference in time there. We're going to turn off query plans at the beginning of that so that we don't like have any duplicate, like we don't so we don't get a query plan for anything else, basically. So there's all sorts of good stuff you can do to get performance information too, right? So like that's often a very critical step, is being able to, like, when you have a performance problem, like focusing on the queries where you know like performance is either like important or an issue generally, so that you don't have to, you know, sift through 10 billion like variable assignment and like tiny little query plans that don't add up to anything. It just gets annoying and frustrating. And sometimes query plans get so long, like from store procedures that do a lot of stuff, that like you try to scroll down to the bottom and there's just this like big empty space in SSMS, and it's like, okay, what happened to the query plan? Can't render it. Then guess what? You have to open up like the plan as XML and edit out a bunch of stuff and like delete a whole bunch of like the statement stuff and then reopen it. It's a nightmare. So don't do that. And then of course, error handling, try catch stuff, all very important when it comes to debugging. But like one thing that I find invaluable when it comes to debugging things is at the end of the procedure, I like to have a full accounting of what parameter values, like the way that parameter values got passed in, especially if I end up doing any parameter value manipulation, I want to know what changed in there. And I also want to know what variable assignments happened along the way so that I can get some sense of like if anything in here is unexpected as to like the flow of logic in the procedure, I want to know what values I ended up with. So there's all sorts of good stuff you can do with a procedure like this, or with debugging, to give you some sense of like where you are in the procedure, stuff like that, like how you're making progress. Again, printing dynamic SQL, things like that. A link to this script will be available in the video description because it's useful for people to see these kind of examples so that they can incorporate them in their own store procedures when they're doing things. But, debugging is a very, very important step in building maintainable and, like triageable procedures, right? Because if it's just some big long procedure with some crappy comments in it, and you start all of a sudden having problems, and it's either erroring out or it's miserably slow, you're going to have a hard time figuring a lot of stuff out, right? And, let's face it, like code is a lot like data. It never tends to shrink, right? Like you never end up working with less data or working with fewer lines of code. Everything just keeps getting bigger and messier and more complicated and harder to use. So you should really put as much debugging as you can into things from the beginning, so you're not stuck, or you're not like caught flat-footed when you start having a problem. B, it takes a long time to sort of like work all the debugging stuff in and not introduce more errors with the debugging stuff. So yeah, anyway, I hope you enjoyed yourselves. I hope you learned something, and I will see you in the next video in the series about store procedures, where I forget what the topic is, but I promise it will be equally as exhilarating. So anyway, thank you for watching.